Top snare mic versus bottom snare mic. Should you be using the same style of EQ on the top and bottom snare, or should you be using a different style of EQ or EQ technique on your top and bottom snare? Let's talk about it and let's discuss. So before we dive into today's tutorial, I just want to let you know that if you're looking to truly improve the sound of your productions and mixes, I don't care if you're using an analog console, a DAW, outboard gear, a tape machine, stock plugins, overpriced, expensive plugins, it really doesn't matter. The way to achieving professional sounding results comes down to just understanding basic, fundamental EQ and compression. And because of this, I'm offering you direct access right now for absolutely free to my crisp and clear heavy mix formula. The crisp and clear heavy mix formula is comprised of three primary components: an EQ and compression mixing cheat sheet that's in the form of a simple PDF that you can reference at any time while you mix. The PDF guide contains clickable links to private tutorials where I break down my mixing process for each of the main instruments within a heavy production. And each tutorial comes with a multi-track download so you can mix along with me and practice your mixing while watching the tutorial. Again, the crisp and clear heavy mix formula for right now is absolutely free. You can have direct access by clicking the link below in this video's description. So without any further ado, I'm gonna play an audio sample here of some drum tracks. Now, these drum tracks are 100% natural. They are not programmed drums. There's no drum samples. It's just a drum set set up in my project studio of a basic production. And it showcases my usual technique for how I go about EQing my snare top mic and snare bottom mic. And I wanna share it with you because it's something that people seem to be confused about. And I get a lot of questions regarding this topic. So let's take a listen to the sample and then I'll break down my exact process and my methodology and my mindset behind how I EQ snare drum for both top and snare bottom mics. Let's take a listen. Okay, so there you have it. Again, this sample, the drums are completely natural, and I decided to use this sample instead of using a production that's a little more complex, because sometimes if you're doing something that's more extreme, there are gonna be, snare samples layered in, or if I'm mixing programmed drums, I might be using less EQ, because again, a lot of programmed drums are already EQ'd and heavily processed at the source, and this is the antithesis of that. It's the complete opposite. These drums were recorded in my budget project studio with a budget interface and budget microphones way back in 2011. So it gets to show you how I would process my snare top and bottom mics with completely raw tracks that were recorded clean on the way into my interface, no EQ, no compression on the way in. So now, let's talk about the relationship between a snare top mic and a snare bottom mic. The way I think of it, a snare drum is really two different sounds. You have the smack and the fatness of a snare top, the top of the snare where the drummer actually hits, and then you have the sizzle and the high frequencies coming from the actual snares, those things that are attached to the bottom of the snare drum. This is why I always recommend miking both the snare top and bottom when recording, because again, a snare drum, in my mind, is really two different sounds. So because of this, there are a few different ways that you could go about processing your snare top and bottom tracks. I've seen people use, the low end from the snare top mic and really heavily filter out the snare bottom. I've seen people, try to get a lot of extra oomph and low end out of their snare bottom track in conjunction with their snare top track, even trying to get more low end out of the snare bottom from the snare top. And the way that I like to do it, in a nutshell, let's take a look at the EQ on my snare top mic here. Okay, now this EQ might seem really extreme. Now this is an older production of mine before I understood drum tuning. So I would just literally have the drummer set up, stick microphones on the drums, get a decent mic placement and just record. That's why this EQ seems a little extreme. But either way, the overall methodology here is what I would use today, where as you can see, I'm allowing a lot of low frequency content into the snare top mic. And let's take a listen to the snare top mic in solo. You hear a lot of fatness, a lot of attack, even some cymbal bleed, again, because remember, this is a live snare track. And let's now take a look at my snare bottom mic As you can see with this EQ, I'm rolling off a ton of low end. Now this might seem really extreme. Actually, to be specific here, I'm rolling off all frequencies below 4K. And that's because I'm achieving so much snap and attack from the snare top mic. I just want the sizzle of the bottom snares. But it is adding a lot to my drum sound. Let's hear the snare in solo, or the snare bottom track in solo. So it's just this attack that you're hearing, or just this sizzle of the bottom snare. Let's hear them combined, or better yet, I'm gonna play the snare top mic and then I'm going to reintroduce the snare bottom track, and just listen to how much more three-dimensional it makes my snare sound in general. I couldn't live without it. Again, this is a technique that I still use to this day. The other thing I want to mention is that if you're recording live drums, if you do plan on using a lot of the mid-range and low end from your snare bottom mic, remember you might have to flip the phase on the track. If you go in your DAW and you look at the two waveforms, if they are 180 degrees out of phase, which they often are, if you're miking your snare from both top and bottom, you will have to flip the phase. Now, with the way that I'm EQing my snare bottom track here, by removing so much of the low end, the lower mids, and even some of the upper mids, and just revealing the top end, I don't have to flip the phase because there aren't going to be any phase issues because I'm filtering out the snare drum so heavily. Now, I also want to mention this. I get this question a lot. People freak out when they see all of the reverb sends on my snare bottom track, and I just want to briefly explain to you my reasoning behind this. A lot of times, if you have your snare bottom track too loud in your mix, even if you're using a lot of the low end from the snare bottom, or if you're doing something similar to what I'm doing here and only using the top end, it's going to sound papery if the snare bottom is too loud in the mix. And let me just show you what I mean by that. There is something about that sound that I absolutely hate, and I've always hated. So I like to keep my snare bottom track lower in my mix. And the thing that my ear always wants to hear, and I've always been like this, is I like to hear a lot of the reverb from the snare bottom, but we have to remember the snare bottom is very, very quiet in my mix. So I like to use just one single drum reverb across all of my drum tracks, kind of like how engineers would mix on an analog console if you only had one reverb unit in your rack. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a reverb sent to, in this case, let's see the reverb I'm using. I'm just using a stock reverb plugin in my DAW. And I'm sending a boatload of signal to that reverb, technically 5 times more than I'm sending to my snare top mic. But again, it's a lot of verb, but the track is so low in the mix that it just adds this nice ambience and this nice splat to the snare drum that's not overbearing, again, because it's so low, but I miss it when it's gone. Right now, I'm gonna play the sample back without the snare bottom, how I had it originally, and then I'm gonna reintroduce it as the mix is playing back, and just listen to how much more three-dimensional it makes my snare drum. Let's take a listen. To me, that makes a massive difference. Remember, these are completely natural drums, and I want the drums to sound realistic and how they sound in an actual room, and the snare bottom is a huge part of that sound. So let me know, I'm curious to know, how do you EQ your snare top mic versus your snare bottom track? I don't care if you're using program drums or live drums or drum samples. I just want to hear your opinion and how you approach snare drum EQing. And again, remember, if you're looking to improve the sound of your mixes and productions for real, you can have direct access right now to my crisp and clear heavy mix formula. You get an EQ and compression mixing cheat sheet, private tutorials for all of the main instruments within a heavy mix, as well as a multi-track download that accompanies each tutorial so you can practice your mixing along with me. The crisp and clear heavy mix formula is free for right now, and you can have direct access by clicking the link below in this video's description. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. If you're interested in some Frightbox swag, I've got t-shirts, mugs, and a ton of other cool stuff on the way. There's a link below to the Frightbox merch store in this video's description. And until next time, happy mixing.